All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for coming down today. We are live from Books and Books in Coral Gables, Florida, so a note to our internet audience watching at home. If at any time during the presentation you'd like to purchase a copy of today's book, you could just call the number on your screen. We'll take care of that for you. We will get the book signed, and we will get it shipped to wherever you are in the United States free of charge. Also, a note for all you Books and Books fans out there, we have a new location in the Carnival Tower of the Adrienne Arsht Center for the Performing Arts downtown. We have a beautiful new restaurant and bookstore there, so please check out Books and Books at the Arsht. This afternoon, Books and Books is very happy to welcome Mr. Kenneth Trebincevich and Ms. Susan Shapiro, presenting their new book, The Bosnia List, a memoir of war, exile, and return. Mr. Trebincevich was born in the quiet Eastern European town of Brčko. At age 11, war broke out, and his Bosnian Muslim family was exiled to the United States, where he eventually became a citizen in 2001. His work has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, the International Herald Tribune, the Wall Street Journal, Salon, and many other outlets. Ms. Shapiro is an American-born Jewish journalist who has written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, and The Nation, among others. She is the author of 8 books, including the memoirs Lighting Up, 5 Men Who Broke My Heart, and Only as Good as Your Word. And she is also a writing professor at the New School and at New York University. Today, Mr. Trebincevich and Ms. Shapiro will be in conversation with local journalist Eleanor Goldberg. But first, we're going to start off with a visual presentation, so please welcome to the podium Mr. Kenneth Trebincevich.
Thank you, Victor.
Thank you.
So I admit it that I hold grudges, but then again, I have reasons to. When I was 12 years old, my favorite karate coach, Shapiro, came to my home with an AK-47, shouting, "You have 1 hour to leave or be killed." He took my dad and older brother, Eldon, to a concentration camp. This was the spring of 1992. My mother, Disa, was a pretty red-headed neatnik who worked at the clothing company. My father, Keka, was a well-popular athletic trainer, the unofficial mayor of town. We were so shocked when our Christian-served classmates and neighbors turned on us, and overnight, and all of a sudden wanted us dead just because we're Muslim. My name is Kenneth Trebinovich. I was born in 1980 in an Eastern European town called Brčko. My family was exiled in the Balkan War and came to America in 1993 when I was 13. I became an American citizen and got my degree in physical therapy at the University of Hartford, Connecticut. Living in Queens, New York, I consider myself a regular guy into soccer and Seinfeld reruns. Yet the minute I decided to visit my former home, I had vengeful fantasies of confronting old friends who betrayed me. My memoir, The Bosnia List, chronicles my family's escape from the ethnic cleansing campaign that swept the former Yugoslavia. After 2 decades in America, my father desperately wanted to visit Brčko again, so Ed and I agreed to take him. Vacation for a normal 30-year-old single American guy at the time meant partying and romance. However, this time for myself, I wrote a list of 12 items and included people I wanted to avenge. Still so angry at what Coach Shapiro did to my family, at the top of my list was to stand at Shapir's grave to see if he was really dead. Last time I saw my Serb karate coach, he was armed, laughing at me. But soon after that, I learned that he was shot to death by one of his own. And he was 30, the same age I was when I returned to Bosnia. So this picture was taken in 1990, the day I received my blue karate belt. And I'm standing below Coach Shapiro, who's pictured in a blue Navy suit, standing above me with his arms draped around my shoulders. And fast forward 3 years later on, Shapiro ended up in the cemetery. While there, I kept reliving the horrible year when we were the last Muslim family in Brčko trying to escape. I remember that on my first bread run, a bullet nicked my forehead. On the way back home, I bumped into my favorite teacher, Milutin, who shoved his rifle barrel against my head. Just backtrack 1 minute, excuse me. This is the concentration camp where Coach Shapiro took my dad and brother to. So the picture on the right is from 2011 when we went to visit, and I brought my dad and brother to pay respect to their fallen friends and our neighbors. Picture on the left was taken by a BBC correspondent in 1992, the day they came to document atrocities. And I found this picture online. I thought it'd be cool to like superimpose them to show before and after. This photograph was taken in 1986 in celebration of Republic Day holiday, in which my favorite teacher, Milutin, pictured in the top left-hand corner, made our first class pledge and swear that we will always defend and protect the brotherhood for which Yugoslavia stood for. On that day, we were to wear our traditional blue hats and red scarves representing Tito's pioneer to show solidarity. However, on the way to school, my dad stopped me and said, "Take that thing off your head." And I said, "How come other kids are wearing it too?" And he said, "Please don't have your picture taken with a hat on." So I didn't. It was only years later when Susan had me look through photographs from a fish in the book that I came across the picture, and I remember the story. And I see myself in the top row, fifth from the left, not wearing the traditional outfit. And that's when I understood what my dad meant for. My family would made it out of Bosnia in January 1993, sneaking on the last bus to Austria. We lived in Vienna as refugees for 10 more months. There I won a contest in International Bosnian newspaper in which I unloaded my hurt and anger in form of words and pictures at my friends who betrayed me. Our fellow refugee friends and neighbors throughout Europe, they were dispersed. They read my article and were able to connect with us. My mom was so happy that she hugged me and gave me pastry. And then an interfaith council of churches and synagogues sponsored us to come to the States, and we wound up in Connecticut, foreigners with little English and $300 in our pocket. Our immigrant story consisted of rented apartments with donated and mismatched furniture. But my dad refused to be on welfare. So for 60 hours a week, he painted houses, flung poultry at Boston Chicken, and punched the clock at the fruit cup factory, while mom drove herself from chemotherapy she needed to battle breast cancer. And then in junior high, I was afraid that big, rich American kids would make fun of my accent, grammar mistakes, and skinny frame hidden in worn clothes I lugged 4,372 miles. When everyone said, "Hi, Kenan," first day of school, I felt like a stray dog at Humane Society waiting to be adopted. But luckily, a Catholic Spaniard named Miguel befriended me. So he offered me a desk to sit next to his. And then at lunch, he shared his tater tots with ketchup, my first American food. He taught me how to play football and baseball, which I never played before. But he was the worst sport I've ever met aside from me. Then when I joined a local soccer team, my teammates guessed that the reason I outran everyone was because I had to run away from bullets in Bosnia. So my nickname became the Bosnian Bomber. When we won the championship, I jumped on the back of Coach Ted Papadopoulos, a Greek giant who handed me an MVP trophy with my name engraved. I hadn't connected with Coach since Shapiro. When the school bus usually let me 45 minutes away from home, the new bus driver, who was from Israel, named Ophir, started keeping me last, then secretly drove me home all the way. That was our little secret, so he didn't get in trouble. And then Reverend Don Hodges from United Methodist Church took us to Manhattan to see the Statue of Liberty, but I was too afraid to eat hot dogs off the cart since the guy's hands looked dirty to me. When I was in high school, I wanted to rent my favorite movie, Back to the Future. I remember it was only $1. Cars don't fly, Mom said. There's nothing you can learn from that. She insisted watching her favorite movie called Schindler's List. While watching it, she said, "This is our story, exactly what happened to us." I looked at her and I said, "What do Jews have to do with us in World War II?" She said, "I should never forget those who did us harm, but I should always remember the good people too, or any good deeds that came from anyone." Being and feeling displaced teenager who was very angry at what happened to us, I looked at him and said, fine, I can probably count them on one finger. You thanked him. But while finishing the book, I wrote a list of 12 Christian Serbs who helped us escape Bosnia in some way. There was a Serb soldier who filled our propane gas tank and snuck food to us at night. Then a bus driver who waited for us in a blizzard to take us to safety to Vienna while the checkpoint guard was contemplating whether he wanted to shoot us. And then there was a policeman also named Pero who wrote us papers to get us free right before he saved my dad and brother from going to a second concentration camp. So in my child's mind, my karate coach was bad Pero and this policeman was good Pero. Then 3 years ago, I had a physical therapy patient named Susan, who was a journalism teacher, always grading stacks of essays and never paying attention to her exercises. So once I felt aggravated. I walked over and I said, is your assignment what I did on my summer vacation? I asked sarcastically. She said, actually, the first assignment I give to my students is to write 3 pages about your most humiliating secret. You're Americans, I said, laughing. Why would anyone reveal that? She said, because it helps you heal, and editors want unusual voices. That night, she emailed me a piece her female student had just published about how her mother, a Holocaust survivor, coped with the anniversary of suicide of her father. So remembering how I won the Vienna contest, I decided to try. So the 3 pages I wrote wound up in New York Times. But the English wasn't my first language. I majored in science. Only thing I'd written before that were science, chemistry labs, and cheesy love notes. The next thing Susan said was, why don't you try a 3-page flashback scene? I said, no way, I can't remember. But that night, 43 pages poured out of me. After my Penguin book editor, Wendy Wolf, read my proposal, she said, man, I admire your ability to hold grudges for so long. I'm so good at holding grudges myself that I even held on behalf of others. But that's when I knew I was in good hands. But I didn't want to write another strictly academic and political book. Susan and I wanted to tell the story of a 12-year-old boy caught in the war, juxtaposed with perspective of a 30-year-old American citizen at a time. But still, I feared that I didn't have a right to report on a Balkan battle. I wasn't a war hero or soldier like my cousin Mirza. He later told me that the only reason he got there alive was because he didn't want to die a virgin. But when he read my book, he said, you know, this is the first time in 20 years I felt like a winner. And you don't know this right now, but you've done more with this book than I could have done with a rifle. In the first chapter, I wrote that because I had to leave Bosnia at 12, I'd never kissed a girl from home. But since the publication, I received some lovely offers to remedy that from a beautiful Balkan woman from all over the world. And even a better perk than mom's pastry, for sure. I'd like to thank everyone here for listening to my story. I'm still a person who holds grudges, and resentment might never disappear. Yet, revisiting my homeland, reconnecting my family, giving my younger generation a voice, and revealing what happened to me, it helped me see my past differently. I'll always be proud to be Bosnian. I enjoy my double identity, and I'm privileged to also feel and be an American. So I'm beginning to feel more lucky than bitter. My mother always wanted to write our story, but she was too sick to do it before she died. But she used to tell me, can you please stop bouncing a basketball for once and read a book? Well, she'd be happy to learn that I've written our story and dedicated it to her. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenan. And I'm Susan Shapiro, and I'm in from New York. And I happened to find out that one of my star students from New York now lives in Miami and is a journalist and a Huffington Post editor, Eleanor Goldberg. So I called her up. I'm like, hey, Eleanor, guess what?
Nice.
Boy, do I have a book event for you. So I'm thrilled to introduce Eleanor, and she's going to interview us about the Bosnia list.
Thanks so much. So it is Valentine's Day weekend, so I thought we could start off with some of the more romantic topics related to this book. When I met Sue a few years ago, she was actually working on a book called 5 Men Who Broke My Heart. Brilliant book, I recommend it. She went back and interviewed 5 exes to find out what went wrong in order to help inform her relationships. And It actually worked, right? So my question for you, Sue, just to start, how did you go from Five Men Who Broke My Heart, a very lighthearted, fun, brilliant, also brilliant book, to the Bosnia list?
I love that question because when my husband read the first draft of the Bosnia list, he's a history buff and he loved Kenan and he knew the whole story. When he read it, he said to me, the way that I structured it was 5 Bosnians that broke my heart. And what I learned from writing Five Men Who Broke My Heart was that as a writer, if you just write backstory, it's really boring. So if you go to write an essay or a memoir and you just say, this happened to me 20 years ago, this happened to me 30 years ago, who cares? It's not interesting. But what I found with Five Men Who Broke My Heart is that if I'm making a phone call to talk to somebody that I haven't seen in 25 years and I'm really nervous and I say to them, would you meet for coffee? And actually one of them I said, do you want to meet and talk about things that happened in the past? And he said, I would rather take out my own appendix with a bottle of Jack and a dull spoon. Then everybody wants to hear, well, what happened? So interestingly, when Kenan was telling me his story, he wasn't just, when I was his patient, he wasn't just saying to me that what happened in Bosnia, he had just gone back. So he told me how he stood on the grave of Pero and he confronted Petra, the next door neighbor who stole from his mother. So in my head, I think weirdly that actually helped me. And the other thing that helped me with the Bosnia list to help Kenan tell the story in a way that Americans would be interested in and that young people would like is that it was a very, very emotional book. And it really was all about where I was in relationships. And there was a weird connection because I was turning 40 when I wrote that, and I was kind of having a midlife crisis, and there was a part of me that felt like I had to go back before I could move forward. And with Kenan, he was turning 30, and he had just seen his homeland, and I felt like, he was going through a crisis. And I would say our biggest problem was I kept saying to him, not only how do you feel, how did you feel, but also, which he wasn't used to doing, but also, were you involved with someone at the time? And that was some of our best fights.
Yeah. Susan was really intrigued about my past and being Jewish, and I also know that she told me a story that she had relatives who died in the Holocaust. So I felt a connection because our people shared a similar faith in Europe. My mom always used to say, Jews are the only people that understand us. And I had no idea what she meant because the Holocaust happened 50 years ago, 60 years ago, but I was too young to understand. And we had some interesting fights. She used to tell me, well, how do you feel? I'm like, I don't know how I felt. My mom was telling me, she was too busy telling me to duck away from bullets. So I never really made sense of how we survived. So while the story became I had a personal agenda in my own mind to make sense, how did I end up here? It became a moral obligation to tell the story for anyone who's been persecuted because of religion and ethnicity. And
and just to go back to something you mentioned when you were just talking, just to, when you guys did come to this book with sort of similar experiences. You wrote this book when you were 40 and struggling with relationships, and you went back to Bosnia and you said, had you stayed there, if you were 30 there, you would have been married, you would have had kids, you would have had a home, and instead of having to start over in America. And I know Sue had to sort of convince you to put a line in the book that you left having never kissed a girl from home. And there was a lot of talk about the loss, the experiences that you never were able to have because you left at 12 and had to sort of adjust to a new life here. So can you talk a little bit about that specifically?
I don't need this right. Well, that's how the first, I remember when I took her memoir class, there was an agent and editor, and students were going around the room pitching their stories and books, and I wanted to write about a Yugoslavian-themed lounge that was meant to bring different factions together through music and food and dancing. And it was called Marshall, after Tito. However, it only lasted about a year and 2 months because it turned into disaster. People almost killed each other. They were stabbed. And he said, stop right there. If you ever write a book, that should be your first chapter. And I remember going there, walking into the bar, and it was so cool because it's something I never experienced home. I was only 12. So all the years of dating and having fun experience in teenage years were put on hold. Where my brother, who was 18, he's experienced that. So I never walked into our bar and ordered a drink or food in our language until I came to Astoria, Queens, because we moved to Connecticut, and I didn't know any Bosnians there. So for 13 years, I was surrounded by Americans. There weren't any immigrants. I went to a really good middle school and high school.
Yeah, we had a big argument there because he told me, we were doing physical therapy and we had a lot of time to talk. And so he told me that at the first scene that he went with his brother to this bar, he had mentioned that there was chef from Croatia and food from Bosnia, and the owner was Bosniak. And there were beautiful Serbian waitresses that he was staring at. So I said, so were you picking him up? What was going on with you and your brother? And he said, no, I had just been brokenhearted. I was totally inconsolable. I couldn't even ask somebody out. So I'm like, we have to put that in. And he was like, no, and sort of a macho Bosnian male personality. So we had to have a big argument. Why did we put that in? And I said, I'll tell you the truth. If you start the book and you and your brother are at this bar checking out women, you just seem like a dog. Like, why am I going to like you? But if you say that not only were you hurt, but also, we get, you lost your mom to cancer. If we get a sense of how vulnerable you are, then I think that women would respond a little bit better to the story. And what was interesting is he could reveal every single thing when it came to bullets and war. He could get into that, but I think it was a 3-week fight. Whether we were allowed to say.
I got a question. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and actually I think I put the word. I said something, that I was heartbroken, and then he said that's a chick word. I was pissed.
Yeah.
You could say I'm pissed. So we would have funny arguments about what we were allowed to say.
And despite all the arguments you guys had, this book really has been called a Muslim Jewish book of healing. You're come from Jewish background, you have a Muslim background, and it seems like even your experience there's been a lot of healing. You met because you were injured. Can you talk a little bit about how you met and your relationship and sort of how this idea even happened?
Yeah, well, he's this fantastic physical therapist, and really my back was horrible. I tore 2 ligaments in my lower back, and nobody could do anything with it. And he was very sensitive and really fantastic. And pretty early on, when I told him to try to write, he said, "I don't write, I fix backs." And so we made a deal, which was, I said, "You fix my back, I'll fix your pages." And weirdly, it worked out. It worked out really well. And it was interesting because he had never really told anybody the whole story before. And as he said, I was shocked. I said, did you talk to your family about it? When his brother read the book, he was shocked at how he felt. And I said to him, why didn't they ask you how you felt? And that's when he said they were too busy telling me to duck. We didn't talk about it. We talked politics. They would argue politics.
We always talk about politics with people we hated. But we never discussed about our feelings. Parents both were sick, looking for new jobs, and it's a new country. It's another burden to add to them. And
so, we had a joke that I became his Jewish mother and his shrink.
Well, I know how fantastic of an editor and teacher you are from personal experience, but can you, Kenan, just talk about those first few pages you wrote and how Sue reacted? I know she can be really harsh, but in the best way possible with amazing constructive criticism. But so how did you react having, no actual writing background and what you first wrote and sort of how she responded?
By the way, I thought he was when I first met him, he was all 20, there were like 20 things going on. He was really, really busy. And I thought, this kid has a two-minute attention span. I'm never going to keep his attention. And I remember after I told him to write it, he said, forget it. And I remember I came to a physical therapy appointment, and he was, Susan, come here, Susan. And he ushered me in, and he had heat and electrodes. He did all these things, and I'm laying flat on my back. And then he hands me 3 pages, and he's like, what do you think? What do you think? Isn't that a good line? What do you think? And I remember I thought I turned my mellow Muslim physical therapist into a neurotic Jewish freelance writer in one session. And then I remember
said Muslim and Frank who lived.
Yeah.
Muslim.
Well, first he said what do you think? And I said, I read the whole thing, 3 pages, and I was like, this blows my socks off. And he looked at me, said, no good, and because he didn't know the colloquialism, and I said, this is so good. And he's like, really? And I said, I remember, because it was about, he's 12 years old and everyone's turning on him because of his religion, and his brother and father were in a concentration camp. And he said, who would care about my story? And I looked at him and I said, you're like the male Muslim Anne Frank who lived to tell the story of what happened. I was blown away. And then our editor, Wendy, a Jewish editor from Penguin, went crazy over it. And
for me, it was more like a cathartic process. Like, I never made sense, again, like how we survived. So every time I remember another story, another scene, there was almost like another roadblock I had to find my way around. So I had to relive all those moments, but this time make sense out of them as an adult. And I remember, like, I can be in a shower and I would jump out, remember the scene, I'd write it down. I could be at the bar, I would text myself long dialogues. And I remember one of the first things that Wendy said was, I'm not disputing this never happened, but she's like, how do you remember like the scenes of what people wore? And it was just the way Susan would ask me like questions. What did this person wear? Where did they stand? And it just like the whole movie started like playing in my head. And it was just like she was such a brilliant teacher.
Yeah, there was something I was going to say. I forgot, there was something when we were writing the book. What? Oh, the dreams, yeah.
Oh, dreams,
so,
yeah.
So what happened was there were certain things that just couldn't be reconciled. Like just for an example, we were on a chapter where he was talking about Pero, who was his coach, his karate coach, and even though he was dead, it was unresolved. So we spent a session talking about it, and the next time he came in and he said, I had this weird dream, and he dreamt that he was back at the
karate camp. I mean, the karate gym where the Pero brought his captors and killed him, and he looked like scruffy. I remember like there was the same jacket and a black belt, and I remember like I know I was at that point like 20 years older, and everyone around me had same faces, but their voices were deeper, so I knew they were older. And he basically said, I mean, there's like a whole page in the book, oh look, we're back, 18, 19 years later on. Isn't the gym nice? They repainted the floor, and he wanted to just start the practice over. And in protest, I stepped in front of him and I said no. And then he, in a way, he was so shocked, and he said, well, can we just forget about the past and just like move on? And I don't want to get into like the detail, but then he faded away in the darkness. And I remember wondering in a dream if he knew he was still dead. And the next day I couldn't wait to tell it. Like I got up and I just rolled this down.
I was like, breakthrough. He was like, does this mean anything? I'm like, yes, write that down, write that down. So it was almost like the things that he couldn't reconcile in real life, he was struggling with. And so his subconscious forced a reconciliation. And one of the heaviest ones was right as he was about to go on the book tour, and he went to all the Bosnian enclaves like in St. Louis and Chicago. And right before he left, he told me he had a dream, and it was that he was back in Bosnia, and there was one of the kids who had betrayed him, and he wanted to go beat him up, and he was walking down like to go start a fight, and he said, and all of a sudden Susan's there, and she says, don't be stupid, don't cause a fight, you have a good life in New York, don't do this. And then he went up to his
old apartment, and then all of a sudden like she was sitting there with Miguel's mom, who's Catholic, and the mom comes out of the room, and I guess it was her birthday, and then she walks over to Susan and says, thank you for helping my son write a story.
And he said, what does that mean? And I'm like, it means your Jewish mother, your Muslim mother, and your Catholic mother all, said Mazel Tov, do great on your book tour. But so it was like so inside him that he was like dreaming scenes while we were writing it. So it was kind of wild.
Probably sounds weird, but I'm not at all surprised, Sue, that you infiltrated his dreams and had him working while he was sleeping.
She used to like edit, and I used to send her pages endlessly, and then she'd be calling and crying, like, oh my God, why are you crying? Because she'd be in such a scene engulfed in 1992.
Yeah, because it would be, he would send me pages and pages and pages about, just like heartbreaking. Like they finally get out after 6 attempts, and the day they land in Vienna, his mother finds a lump in her breast. And it was just, and then they go to Connecticut, and she can't afford any treatment. So they have a Jewish oncologist who not only takes care of her with the chemo and radiation for free, but then looks at Kenan's mouth, and then sends him to an orthodontist, and everybody was, took care of him for free. So I was just crying because it was so sad. And it was interesting because he really couldn't cry. So it was almost like he was giving it to me to cry.
And these are just some of the examples, I think, of the healing that you talk about. And you talked about how you approached the trip, going home and sort of having to confront all these people who betrayed you. And there's a lot of anger when you go into the trip. But ultimately, when you get there, there's so much reconciliation. And you even mention at the end that you feel lucky. And can you talk about how, in such a brief period, your perspective was able to change?
I think when I came back, again, I was so confused, and I started talking more about my brother about it. And when I learned who these people were all along, it made it hurt less, especially my karate coach. There's things about him that I didn't know that my brother knew, people that were older that went to the bars with him, what kind of person he was all along, and it totally made sense how, war brings the best or worst out of people. And that helped one part of reconciliation. And also when I went back and realized, how do we stay alive in this building, and so many different attempts and chances my dad could have gotten killed, my mom could have gotten raped, when police chief saved bus from leaving, taking my dad to another camp. I started to remember all those things. People brought us food and helped us collectively escape. I realized that we're probably the luckiest Muslim family stuck in Birch Grove for so long. We're probably the only one in town because we didn't know anyone. And everyone knew who we were, most of the neighbors, even though they stole things from us. I got beat up a lot of my friends. In a way, no one ever pointed us out to paramilitaries. In a way, they didn't want us there, but they didn't want us to leave either.
But also, Kenan talked a lot about what's going on in Bosnia now, because you said it's 40%
If I stay there,
unemployment.
If I stay there, I would get a job based on what political party I'm in. I know doctors and lawyers who are cleaning houses. There's really no future for young generation there.
So what was really, well, I said to Kenan, as an emotional arc when you're writing a book, you can't start with hate and end with hate. So we needed to go somewhere anyway. And what was really fascinating when I asked him a lot of questions was that he realized he and his brother felt so lucky to be Americans, and they both have fantastic jobs as physical therapists, and he's bi-coastal, and he could travel the world now. And so in a lot of ways, he realized that he weirdly wound up with a better life.
When I went to karate complex, there was an old teammate of mine, Serb, who was sitting there, and I vaguely recognized him, but he looked like 12 years older than me, and it's just based on the hard life that he's having. And he said, yeah, I used to have a job when Americans were here, and so I started to count. I'm like, that was 1996. So I realized that he hasn't had a job since, and he was driving a truck, for them. And he complimented Dad and brother and I that we were in shape, and you guys look like, you're young, you take care of yourselves. And I just realized that they get to live, and they're stuck in a place that they created a hellhole, for themselves. And I get to go back, come and go whenever I want. So.
And also what was so cool was that he really became a spokesperson for, there were no other books written by an American who could tell the Bosnian story. So he became a spokesperson for, the book came out in Bosnia and had hundreds of newspaper articles in it. And all of his family friends said, thank you for telling our story. And when he was sent all around the country, so that part of it was
and the kids,
was exciting.
people my age, I'm 34, but anyone in their 20s and 30s, usually women will be more open, and they'll send emails and Facebook messages saying how it helped them. It forced them to dig back into their past and fix what's happening currently in their life. And so they would bring this up at the dinner table with their parents, and parents would be so surprised, saying, where is this all coming from? So I get a lot of the messages, thanks for sharing our story for us. We don't have anyone outside here that can tell the truth. And I think this book wouldn't have been able to get published anywhere else in the world other than here, because it's very unfiltered and honest. And what I'm the happiest the most out of is that I was able to rewrite the history. And our history was always written in Belgrade by their politicians. So that's the part I'm really proud of. Especially I think when we gave it to Wendy, Wendy said, okay, it looks nice, it looks great. However, now you have to add 200 pages about Balkan history.
Just add 100, just
100
add 100 pages
pages
of Yugoslavian history so Americans know what the hell you're talking about.
Yeah, so we had to do it so we don't come out of a theme, because we don't want it to sound like another political boring book, especially for younger generations. So we told the history through the story of the family. So when I went to the cemetery, I asked my dad a lot about our relatives and how come 4 of them fought on 4 different sides of the war in World War II. So there's a lot of that.
I always say to my students, 2 lines I told them that he liked. One was that writing is a way to turn your worst experience into the most beautiful. And then I said to him, the pen is mightier than the sword. And he said to me, wow, what a great line. I'm like, didn't invent that line. Didn't invent that one.
Take credit.
And so you mentioned how it was received in Bosnia. How was it received by your family? Your mother has passed away, but how did your brother and father feel about the book?
I remember going back to what Susan mentioned earlier, when we wanted to make sure that Eldon, my brother, was okay with the way he was portrayed in the book. And I remember when I sent the pages, he said, I'm coming over. And I'm like, uh-oh, something's up. And then he comes in, he's like, what the hell, dude? And I knew what he meant. I never told him about the teacher who held a rifle to my head, and also when a neighbor waited for me to carry a water-filled canister home, a heavy jug, because I was the only one that can go out and get supplies, because I was younger age. I wasn't 18, and I didn't carry an ID, so if they asked me about my name, I can just lie. So this neighbor shot my water canister, so I told that to my brother. So it started to bring anger out of him that he's had for so long. which is not too far from
But
the
he
surface.
didn't know a lot of the stories
Yeah.
because Kenan didn't tell him because he was afraid if he told anyone in his family,
They're
they
not letting
wouldn't
me
let
go
him
out.
out. They wouldn't let him
Yeah.
outside. So
But-
so it was fascinating for me to hear his brother say, "I didn't know he felt like that. I didn't know that happened."
And my dad, he loves the fact that I'm sharing the political, historical side with the world.
They go with him everywhere,
Yeah.
every event, every single. I think they've been to 50 Bosnia events, and they're very proud. And they interrupt him to tell the rest of the story.
And family, like family cousins who live in Birchgrove, very few left. One day my cousin said to me, "Boy, you're creating a chaos in this town because everyone's talking about it, and then the other side is wondering whether they're in the book because the town is divided." And most recently, one of my neighbors from Astoria went to visit this past summer, and she said, "You either really loved or you really hated." So I remember telling that to Wendy, and Wendy said, "It means we did a good job."
And also, with the, what was I forgot what I was going to say. Why don't we ask questions for that? If anybody has any questions from the audience, I'll remember what I was going to say. So, yes.
You know, I imagine that when the neighbor or the karate coach came over, I mean, the beginning of the war, because I remember Bosnia before, having visited there, where it seemed that everyone was getting along so well. How does one accept that from one day to the next, everything's changed, and people that you loved, relied on, people that you thought were friends, suddenly there's this hatred, this enmity that appears to come from nowhere, that had to have just, literally broken hearts. And
Yeah.
what was that like, and how, I mean, it's taken you all these years to get over it, right? I mean,
Well, I think when it first happens, I was blaming myself. Have I done anything bad to him? Like, why is this happening? Or I would wake up next day and think to myself, oh, I get to go to karate practice, or school's going to start again. And my dad would say, no, you're not going to go to school for a very long time. Or when kids used to pick on me, go outside, my friends, I would go outside thinking, okay, I'm going to play another soccer game. And no, I wouldn't be picked. It was after I wrote the book, we wrote the book, and I reread it so many times, I realized that it was always there. It really didn't happen overnight. I was just too young to understand. And then when I hear other stories of people like through Facebook, they will say, well, in 1978, there was a guy, one of our friends, not to go off tangent, but he had a band playing in a very radical village 10 kilometers from our town. And they wanted to kill him there. This was 1978. And he never told anybody. He thought it was really weird. Why did they want to kill him? And they're like, oh, because you're Muslim. But no one was really religious there. So realizing there was such a strong sense of nationalism that lasted over a couple hundred years, it just surfaced up. And I'd feel bad for older generation the most because they lived with one big lie, especially my parents.
And interestingly, my father's a history buff, and he was relating stuff that happened to the Jews in the 20s and 30s, how it led up to anti-Semitism. And he was sending us books about World War II, and he called Milosevic Hitler. And actually, didn't you even tell me that Milosevic...
Milosevic, he read Mein Kampf, My Life. And that was one of his books that he looked upon to create all this. And then the other day, my brother sent me this document which just came out, and it was called The Frame. And the document was something that Milosevic created, and he said in 1986 he would kill 50% of Bosniaks, 25% he would force to convert, and 25% would probably escape. So that was the plan that it created after Tito died.
Any more questions? Yes.
I have a regularly question.
Erica.
I know, Susan, this is the first time you collaborated with somebody on the book, and it was kind of accidental because it was serendipity. Would you may have been approached since then to collaborate again, and would you?
I actually collaborated once before with my addiction specialist, yes, who helped me quit cigarettes and alcohol, and then we did a book together, and then we did a book that was a bestseller called Unhooked, and the joke was that I needed a shrink to help me deal with writing a book with my shrink. Interestingly,
You get a lot of Bosnians that now email you.
yeah, well, so every Bosnian in the world basically has emailed
But
me
they're
their
doing it the
story.
wrong way.
Right.
They're really
But what's interesting,
aggressive
I'll tell you
and
something interesting.
here's
was
my
that,
story, you gotta
was
do
that
it.
I actually said at a certain point, and I would send him to Kenan, and he would send it to me. And and unfortunately, I said to them, now that we did a book, I think it wasn't like a bestseller. I don't think it would be that easy to sell, even though we've had some movie interest, which would make it better. But so I basically, at a certain point, just in a really nice way, tried to help everybody figure out how to publish short pieces. But I said, it got to a point where I felt like I've heard the story before. And I bumped into an agent, Susan Gollum, at this book party. And she said to me, I got a Balkan story for you. And I said, truthfully, I've heard them all. She said, this one you haven't heard. And it was interestingly, a Serb, a woman whose, it was Andre Pejic, whose mother was a Serb, whose father was a Croat, and was born in the middle of the war. And by the end of the war, the father hated the mother and didn't want anything to do with his children. They moved to Australia, where Andre becomes a famous model and androgynous model, and then moves to this country and has a sex change operation and is transgender. And the line was, it was almost like I was separated in the womb because his parents were. So I'm like, okay, that story I haven't heard before. So we have an offer to do that. So I'm debating whether to do that. But I have a Jungian astrologer who said that I'll take other people higher than I could take myself. So he said the trick is to collaborate, because then it's. But no, I love the process of collaborating. It was, and writing a book, like, you could sit alone in a room for many years. So there's something sort of fun and exciting about, and also truthfully, I have a very non-dramatic life. I basically am from Michigan, moved to New York, had stupid relationship and stupid addictions, went to therapy. Now I'm healthy, have no addictions. That's the whole story. So when Kenan tells me a story, it sort of fuels
then, like,
creativity.
after the book came out, like, we were sitting around, and then, like, another story comes up, and she's like, "Now you're telling me this." Like,
get a piece of paper right now. In fact, I give him notebooks to cross them down. Good. Other questions? We have time for a few more. Yes, in the back. This, sir.
Kevin, how did you get to why the States? Did you have any other choices, like another European country or Canada or Australia?
My dad did some gardening work for this Canadian ambassador in Vienna. He's Austrian, but he went back from actually Quebec to Vienna, and he told my dad, "I can get you guys to Quebec in no time." And Australia wasn't accepting yet, and my dad wanted us to get the best education, so that's why he applied for United States. And I remember we had an interview in September or August in 1993, and as a CIA officer interviewed us. And he wanted a piece of paper that my mom gave him of my dad's release from the concentration camp. And also, when we left, we got a paperwork saying that we'll never return to Bosnia, otherwise they'll take us out. And also, we have to give all the property away. So when he saw the paper, he's like, "Oh, I want that paper." And we understood that was our ticket, basically. And then he said, "Good luck." And then my dad was like, "Oh, we're definitely going." I'm like, "How do you know?" And he said, "No, he's letting us through." So.
It was also interesting that Kenan wrote a beautiful piece for the Wall Street Journal about how there was always these Muslim brothers that were terrorists, and so he analyzed why they had weird things in common in Boston, and even the more recent one in Paris. They had weird things in common with Kenan and his brother, and why did we turn out to, like, embrace the American dream and the other ones turned into terrorists? And one of the things he came to was that when he moved to Connecticut, there were no Muslims that he met at all, but there was an interfaith council who helped him. So his association of America, here was a Protestant, here was the Greek guy, here was the Israeli guy, here was the Jewish doctor, here was the Catholic, and his association from a very young age was that all these people from different religions pitched in to help his family, and in a way that...
I had teachers call the house to ask if I ever needed anything. I would get stopped in the hallway. Had meetings with principals at the principal's office. This was in 8th grade. Any sport I played, coaches were always kind to me. I never got picked on. And another important thing is having a close-knit family. I remember with the Boston Bombers, their mom left them. She went back to, I think, Georgia, Chechnya. And he had his dream of becoming an Olympian boxer. And when that didn't go well, he blamed Americans for not succeeding. But what I did, I took my childhood passion of sports and I turned it into something that I do on a daily basis, which is I do physical therapy, and there are a lot of patients that I treat of injury. So obviously I'm not going to go to NFL or NBA, but...
And interestingly, with the Parisians, they lost both of their parents, so they grew up in foster care, but they were also in a very secular environment. And so Kenan, not only did he have his very, his mom and his dad and brother always by his side, but also to have so many, interestingly, weirdly, to have people of so many different religions and nationalities helping him, really created a
There's also,
good feeling.
because there's a upper middle class to upper class
Connecticut.
community, so I look at my friends, and it's not like, oh, I want a car because you have a car, but I want to be successful. So their parents
Everyone
always
went to college.
Yeah, they used to
everyone
always
went to
preach to
grad
me,
school.
ask me, what are you going to study in college? What are your grades like? So kids that I went to school with were actually all successful today.
So weirdly, he was very lucky to land. in
It's okay to
Connecticut.
have dual life. That's what I have in Queens. Like I can go to a Bosnian store, get Bosnian food, Croatian bar, but then I can dissociate, draw a line, and then hang out with my American friends. And that's what I love about my life right now. So.
Good. Yes.
I didn't want to get too much into your, well, maybe just asking your thoughts about the war, but somebody was mentioning, I know there's sort of this narrative that Balkan people's been killing each other for centuries, and, and I personally feel that's a false narrative. There was periods where everybody got along, and it's very common. And really, the origin of the war was really the economy sunk when Tito died, and there was a power vacuum. It was filled by nationalism, took control of the media, and then they really made these differences amongst people, manipulated people.
Yeah, they use a religion as a marker to separate you from everyone else. But when I grew up, I walked into the mosque once because I thought it was cool. My mom, I walked into Catholic church once, but it was like scary to me seeing a pope. A priest. Nowhere was really religious. I haven't seen anyone covered in Islamic outfits until I came to New York, and I thought it was weird. I asked my mom, how come they're covered, we're not? And she said, well, it comes down to cultural difference. But now the war actually has created worse nationalism, because now people really are all about these certain religious figures, and priests, like the Serbian priests, have done a lot of bad propaganda to stir up usually the rural parts of the countries. The city people, the ones that would be more open-minded and help you. So we were lucky we grew up in a town that, with the neighbors who, I realized when I was talking to Susan, everyone that helped us had some kind of education background. And those people that did the worst, atrocities came from outside of towns, small villages, mountains, that collaborate with the locals.
Interestingly, the editor who did this book, who was very, she knew a lot about Bosnia, she said one of the reasons that she wanted a lot more history through Kenan's family is that she felt that the Bosniak story had not really been told. Because as Kenan said, Serbs had dominated a lot of the history books. So what's really cool is that there's a lot of high schools and colleges that are taking on this book and teaching it in history classes, because there was this little weird slice of history that really hadn't been written. And so, and what was really a funny story is that we were trying to figure out a way to tell the history without, it was such a dramatic story, I didn't want to just say, okay, now here's a clunk of history. So when I was doing 5 Men Who Broke My Heart, which Kenan read, there was something for my family, which is we have a family of doctors. So at the dinner table, they played the disease game. So we would sit down and my dad would say, 42-year-old Cambodian refugee vomiting blood, schistosomiasis. Schistosomiasis, pass the potatoes. And my brothers would jump in, and it was, so I was always written about this. So I said to Kenan, every family has like a routine at dinner. What was yours? So what he remembered was that
my dad would come over
right,
Sundays.
But instead of football and nachos, what his family would do on Sundays, they would chop up vegetables because they're all health nuts, and they would watch the History Channel, and they would watch World War II. And his father and brother would jump in and say.
But one of the scenes was Artur Ferdinand when he got killed in Sarajevo in 1914, and then Eldon would jump and say, killed by a Serbian nationalist.
Yeah, and World War II, and he would say, started in the Balkans by a Serb. And so they actually would jump in and tell the story that they didn't know. So I was like, oh my God, you have to tell me that. So I start writing it down. So actually we went to online, we found the World War II video, and then I called his brother and I'm like, what would you jump in? So it was really cool. So it was actually, Kenan felt because he was the youngest and because he left Bosnia so young, he never really got the whole story. So we told the story through his dad and his brother. And also when he went to cemeteries in Bosnia, it turned out he learned that 4 male family members in World War II all fought for different sides. So we got his father and his brother to remember all the different sides. So we wound up telling the story of Bosniaks and how marginalized they were and how confused they were during World War II. So we actually think that we told a little slice of history that hasn't been told before. Good. Any final questions? Yes.
Ken, when you were writing the story before you thought the book was going to be published, did you feel that it helped relieve your past? And the reason why I ask is because if you're not, your story is an amazing story and really interesting to hear. But for all the people out there, all these Bosnians that have been writing to you, wanting to publish their story, Sue, do you recommend that they write their story to get over it, even if you don't make the 1 in a million chance of publishing your story? How do you guys feel for all the people out there who say, "Oh, an amazing story," but the chance of their book getting published?
Well, when we do events, like how to publish a book, we have one like every few months. Usually there's an agent editor. So Susan usually uses me as an example. So I always tell the story of creating a platform. So writing a couple different essays, getting on editors' radar. And she has a class. We always tell them, take a class, get a ghost editor.
Yeah, by the way, I don't think it's 1 in a million.
Yeah.
I teach really fun classes. I call them the Instant Gratification Takes Too Long School of Writing, where the goal of the class is to write and publish a great piece by the end of the class to pay for the class. And I do 5-week classes, and a lot of people do. So I personally don't think it's that hard to get published. And by the way, I have the least dramatic life. Seriously, my life is like happy family in Michigan, dumb relationships, dumb addictions, went to therapy, moved to New York, married a nice guy. That's the whole ball of wax. So, what? Right, exactly. I had Eleanor as
I think what we had, the reason it worked for us, because most of the history books were mostly written by Western, older acclaimed journalists or concentration camp survivors.
Yeah.
So the story of a 12-year-old boy.
Kenan had a wildly dramatic story, which is why it blew my mind. And the first piece ran not only in the New York Times Magazine, but the International Herald Tribune, because no one had really written this. But I do not have a dramatic life. And there's a great line that I tell people if they have a life like mine, which is, if you got the story, tell it. If you ain't got it, write it. So just for an example, when I was writing about relationships, you can't just say, "Oh, I'm going to write a book about all my exes." That's boring. So I had to come up with a conceit. So I came up with a conceit, which was I'm going to go back and meet my top 5 heartbreak of all times and interview them to find out what really happened in the relationship. So it took me a little bit longer to figure out how do you make this into a story. But I would say with Eleanor, and I have some great students here, that I don't think I've ever had a student who didn't have, and it's write about your most humiliating secret. I don't think in 21 years of teaching I've ever had a student who couldn't come up with a pretty good, write about your most humiliating secret. More often than not, the problem is I can't publish this, because I don't want to. And I always say you can't get divorced, disowned, or fired for an essay. Maybe a book deal, but not an essay. So actually, yeah, so anybody that's willing to, and by the way, I'll give out my cards. We have some cards here, but if anybody's interested, I know tons of great teachers online who teach very similar classes. And I think that essay writing is really fun. And what happens is that in this day and age, what's very cool is that not only, are there newspapers and magazines like the Miami Herald and, great places that are open, but in this day and age, there's millions of online places. I mean, she writes for the Huffington Post. I have an Asian student who launched a book about Chinese war heroes that launched in the Huffington Post, and she got a publishing house in California, and she just did a big, beautiful book on it. So now you got Huffington Post, Slate, Salon, the New York Times has .com. So there are actually quite a few places that are extremely open to new voices and essays, and you just have to know literally the length and who the audience is. So I don't think it's 1 in a million. I think his story, he had a very, very dramatic story, but I have I think I have 83 students that have done books in the last decade, and I would say his is the most dramatic story. And by the way, you feel, at first you were really reluctant to reveal stuff, but now you feel happy you did, right?
Yeah, it feels very redemptive.
Redemptive. Good. Anything final?
Happiness is letting it all hang out.
Oh, hilariously, I'll end with a funny note, which is really quickly. So my family hates everything I write, and especially because they're trying to be private people, and I'm like really out there. So all of a sudden, when we were doing the Bosnia list, my father starts sending me history books, and he bought like 20 copies, and he loved it, and he was so excited, and he's posting, and I'm like, finally, he's come around, and then I realized why. I was writing about someone else's family, so that's why he liked it. Anyway, thank you for coming.
All right, folks, so if there are no more questions, then a quick reminder for our internet audience watching at home, you still have a few minutes to call the number on your screen, buy a copy of the Bosnia list. We will have Mr. Trebincevic sign it for you, and we will ship it to wherever you are in the United States free of charge. Also, a reminder that all of our live streamed events are archived, so if you don't get a chance to watch them live, you can go to the Books and Books website, and any event that we broadcast from here at the store will be saved there for you to watch at your convenience. For those of you here at the house, we have the Bosnia list for sale at the counter over there in that front room. Kenan will be signing there at the panel table. And please, let's give a hand to our 3 panelists today. Thanks very much. Thank you.